know that the theme of the King's Africa Week 2023 was, as has been said, changing Africa in a shifting global landscape. So I will tailor my remarks this evening to this broad theme, while also seeking to answer the question of how Africa can prosper in this shifting global landscape. I think that a point on which there will be no reasonable dispute is that we live in a complex and somewhat confusing period. The lines have never been more blurred in the various conceptual prisms through which we view the world. The existence of several centers of political and economic power since the unipolar world of the 1990s has meant that there are various ways in which global developments are viewed. Of course, in addition to the United States, we have China, Russia, the European Union, the UK, India and Brazil as dominant regional powers. The perspectives, decisions, and actions of these actors impact not only on their regions, but across the world, including in multilateral forums all across the world. The Russian-Ukrainian war is, if we start with that, to just consider how that has impacted the world and in fact has impacted Africa. Apart from its consequences for international peace and security, that war has signaled a breakdown of the global order, which emerged at the end of the Second World War, and is a source of concern to many African countries who now have to steer their way delicately between the major powers. But the more immediate and consequential fallout of the war, as we all know, are the sharp hikes in food prices, especially wheat, sunflower, and sunflower oil, and even rice and maize, and then fuel and fertilizer prices. Many African countries, of course, are heavily dependent on one or both of the warring parties for food and oil. So when the conflict began in February last year, the price of wheat increased by 67% from the price in December 2021. Oil prices similarly went through the roof. International prices for oil averaged $100 per barrel in 2022 as compared to about $70 per barrel in 2021. And then also, given that key manufacturing countries are oil importers, higher oil prices invariably translated to higher prices for manufactured products as well. So these price shocks and disruption of supply chains of various commodities across Africa led to high inflation at a time when most countries were struggling to overcome the economic and social fallout of the COVID-19 pandemic, especially debt and foreign currency crisis. The situation was relieved somewhat by the deal that was brokered to enable the export of Ukrainian wheat. For Nigeria, let me say that despite our strong objection to the invasion of Ukraine, as evidenced by our support for the UN resolution condemning the invasion, we've managed to maintain good relationships with both parties. We're now in the process of working out a grain supply from Russia, coordinated by the World Food Programme, and we recently accepted to provide some space, port space, in Port Harcourt, Nigeria, for the distribution of grain from Ukraine to other West African countries. But I think the economic fallout of the war for us in Africa should be an introspective moment, especially on the issue of self-sufficiency in food production. And there's some good news here and there about that. Zimbabwe, for instance, had its highest ever wheat harvest of over 375,000 tons in 2022. And by that increase in production, it achieved self-sufficiency, at least in wheat production, which is a major component of its food. It achieved this feat by increasing land under cultivation, by improving fertilizer distribution, and ensuring irrigation in the winter months, and an active collaboration between government and the private sector. This means that Zimbabwe is insulated from the sharp increases in global wheat prices, or indeed further fallouts from the war in Ukraine. What this clearly shows is that by proactive measures, African countries can turn this crisis and others into opportunity. It may also be a moment for even bigger ideas. We may reconsider our approach to food production using climate-smart methods that protect and enhance soil health and resilience. There's a lot of work being done by the Climate Action Platform, the Climate Action Platform for Africa, which is an NGO concerned with introducing a different concept. And I might talk about that a little later on. But CAP-A, as it's called, has some very interesting ideas on how we could actually turn some of the problems and crises that we've experienced into opportunity, especially in the climate action area. But a final word on the Russian-Ukraine war. A few days ago, President Lula da Silva of Brazil proposed a peace club, probably led by China. He said he was going to talk to China about this peace club to seek ways of ending the crisis. And I think that that sort of thinking is certainly the way to go. The world must find parties that can be trusted by both sides to intervene. Ultimately, this war, the Russia-Ukraine war, would have to end by negotiations. I think the earlier that started, the better. A word now about China, Africa, and the West. And of course, there's... Okay. So I was talking about China, Africa, the US. In mid-December last year, the US hosted the Africa-US Summit. Only the second of such. The last was sometime in 2014. And there was no question at all that the summit was meant to at least register America's interest in being a more active player in Africa in response to, the evident dominance of the Chinese. China is Africa's largest bilateral trading partner. And China does about $254 billion in trade in Africa. In 2021, we did about $254 billion in trade. China is also the largest provider of foreign direct investment in Africa, supporting hundreds of thousands of African jobs. Now, this is roughly double the level of US foreign direct investment, and China remains by far the largest lender to African countries. Chinese companies have also taken the lead in exploring minerals in Africa, many now in lithium, mining in Mali, in Guinea, in Nigeria, in DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, in Zimbabwe, and in Namibia. Most African countries, as you can imagine, are, in my view, rightly unapologetic about their close ties with China. China also shows up when the West will not or is reluctant to show up. And many African countries, of course, are of the view that the warnings about the Chinese Trojan loans may be wise, but are probably self-serving. Africa needs the loans and the infrastructure, and the Chinese offer them. In any case, the history of loans from Western institutions is not great. The memory of the destructive conditionalities of the Bretton Woods loans are still fresh, and the debris is everywhere. And the preoccupation of Western governments and the media with the so-called China debt trap might well be an overreaction. And I would recommend to you a very eye-opening lecture by Professor Deborah Brottigam about 2 weeks ago. She gave the lecture about 2 weeks ago at the Jesus College, Cambridge. The truth, as she points out, is that all of China's lending to Africa is only 5%, and I think she's, roughly accurate there, of all the outstanding public and publicly guaranteed debt in low and middle income countries, compared to 23% held by the World Bank and other multilaterals. Chinese lenders account for just 12% of Africa's private and public external debt. And the Chinese, as I've said, have always been there when the debt even cannot be paid. In early 2020, as COVID battered African economies and, of course, economies worldwide, China came together with other G20 members to launch the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, the DSSI as it was called. 73 low-income countries benefited from the suspension of principal and interest payments through the DSSI. Chinese banks provided 63% of the total debt relief, while it only owed 30% of the debt service payments that were due. So, by and large, in the arguments about Chinese, how, the Chinese debt trap, as sometimes called, and the large amounts of loans to African countries, etc. I think that what is clear is that the Chinese have proved to be, by and large, quite responsible in their approach to the giving of these loans. Of course, there are always arguments about whether or not you get the very best deal all the time. But the real question for Africa and African governments is who else is offering these loans? Who else is offering the support? So it really isn't a question of here or there. It really is a question of, well, this is what is available. And, it seems to me that it makes sense to take what at least is available. Then to the question of insecurity. There's some restiveness, as many of us would appreciate, in the continent. And this is driven in part by poverty, alienation, environmental degradation, and in many cases, poor governance.